Hi Barb, how are you?
I am excellent.
Great. Hello everyone, and thank you for being here. Today I have the incredible honor of interviewing a true expert on learning sciences. She's an acclaimed author and distinguished professor of engineering at the Oakland University and has been recognized by several awards in education, like the Harold McGraw Jr. Prize in Education, which is often considered as being the equivalent of the Nobel Prize in Education. So we are talking about someone that's really great and a great person too. Well, through her best-selling books like A Mind for Numbers and the famous online course Learning How to Learn, which has over 4 million of students right now, and also have a Spanish version, she has shown us that our brains are more adaptable than we think, and we always can learn more. So I'm here with Barbara, Barb, as some of us say, and because we are just about to publish the Spanish translation of her book, Uncommon Sense Teaching, and I couldn't help to invite her to talk about this incredible book. I just love it. Just a quick context for who are listening. We have collaborated many times before, since 2023, when you wanted to come to Research at Chile that time, but you went sick. But you insisted to come then in March of 2024, and you gave a lot of talks, incredible talks here in Chile, and then we started to translate your book. Also, we met at Research at Toronto 2024, and this year you are coming again to Chile in October for Research at Chile. So it's great to see you again. Thank you for joining us. And to start, could you please tell us a little more about your journey, your unique journey, and what led you to dedicate your life to disseminating learning science and neuroscience?
I'm happy to do that, but before I begin, I just want to let you all know Matthias is too good a human being to blow his own horn and talk about how good he is, so I can do that. And actually, I've spoken all around the world on learning and written about it and so forth. But Matthias gives me so much, as far as really good ideas for how to improve my speeches and my PowerPoints. And he really is thinking in depth. So he is an up and coming visionary in the field of education. So keep an eye on him in the years to come. But anyway, let me give you a little bit of background. So people who know me already know that I was terrible at math when I was growing up, and I hated it. And so I changed my mind when I was going to get out of the military at age 26, and I could see that all my friends had really good job offers because they had good technical backgrounds, but the kinds of things that I was getting or would be available to me just weren't very interesting, because all I had was a degree in Slavic languages and literature, which actually was a secret weapon of sorts, in that I had learned how to learn a language, but I hadn't really learned a skill that people wanted or needed necessarily. So I ended up just kind of changing my mindset and slowly beginning to learn and be successful in math and science. And now I'm a distinguished professor of engineering, and instead of hating math and science, as I did when I was young, I love math and science. And kind of because I'm interested in a lot of things, but not in a so necessarily, well, I'm interested in a scattered fashion. Sometimes, like some email will come in about a study on tuberculosis, and its origins, 500 years ago. And I'm like, oh, I gotta follow this, even though it has nothing to do with what I'm doing. But somehow along the road, because I had chosen the most alien type of professional expertise that I could possibly choose, which was electrical engineering. So I became an electrical engineer. But it turns out that if you're interested at all in neuroscience, having an electrical engineering degree is really a good skill to have, because a lot of what's happening in neuroscience now involves communication, signal processing, and the way that signals are actually moving through the brain. So another sort of accidental interest of mine was in pathological altruism, and the road to hell is paved with good intentions. But I published a paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, did an edited volume for Oxford University Press. So think about it this way. Then I taught for some 15 years as a engineering professor. So I had this weird confluence of skills. I taught at high level in science, technology, engineering, and math. I had a good background to be able to understand neuroscience, even though I'm not a neuroscientist. I had a kind of an appreciation for the humanities because I had a degree in Slavic languages and literature. And I was also hyper aware of how people can have good intentions that actually mislead them. And of course, I also had an understanding of how the experts can get things wrong, and they can get things wrong in large groups. So perhaps because I moved around a lot when I was growing up, I learned how to think more independently. Just because everybody says things doesn't mean that I'm going to find that same thing. So all of these different backgrounds and assets help me to look at what's going on in education in a unique way. It's basically kind of a stroke of luck that I have this combination of background interests and skills that allows me to begin to understand, first off, how do people really learn? What's happening in their brain when they're really learning? And then how is the field of education sometimes inadvertently or even vertently crippling students' abilities to learn? And so that's kind of how I got into it. That's what I'm interested in. And what I really want to do is help people get on the right track in learning. And so that's what you and I are all about.
Great. That's, I think your story is really inspiring for all of us, especially, for example, me, that I'm also a person that had a lot of problems with math and science in school, and then I had to trying to compensate that after at the university. I'm a psychologist, but also I'm a person who is really interested in several topics, and I'm always looking for learn anything. So, but I think I'm a slow learner. We are going to talk about them, but I think you are such a inspiring person because of your life story and your that you embody what we say about the lifelong learner that is always seeking more learning in different topics, and of course it needs some expertise in specific topics, in domain specific topics, to be an expert, but also that that willing to learn anything. So that's incredibly powerful. We are just launching the translation into Spanish of Uncommon Sense Teaching. We decided to translate the title as Enseñanza Contraintuitiva, which in English means something like teaching that goes beyond intuition, like beyond common sense. And tell us about something about the book in general, and how did you came up with that title and why?
I first thought, this book should be called Common Sense Teaching. And then I mentioned that to my co-author, Beth Rakowski, and Beth was horrified because she said, you might think this is common sense, but actually many people have been so taught that many of the ideas that really truly help people to learn, they've been indoctrinated that these are bad ideas. For example, even the simple idea that memory is important is an anathema. I remember I had one of my engineering students come up to me once and he flunked a test and he waves it in my face and he says, "How could I have flunked this test? I understood it when you said it in class." And educators have gotten so overboard that conceptual understanding is the only golden key to learning that they overlook the fact that if you can't remember what you learned, you really haven't learned it. So what we're trying to do with this book is to place education on a solid foundation, growing from first principles. And that first principles, from our perspective, is neuroscience itself, not psychology. Psychology has a great deal to add, but it's also sort of like examining how a car works by just kind of guessing at it from looking outside the car and examining its operating characteristics by just watching the car. It's moving more inside the brain somewhat with cognitive psychology, but it's still many of the ideas from psychology, which are often quite helpful, aren't built from first principles. What is actually going on within the brain? And when you start from that perspective, what's happening in the brain, you can build a foundation for understanding of how people learn in a very simple, easy to understand way that actually is supremely helpful in overcoming silly things like now you'll often hear, well, are you teaching knowledge or are you teaching skills? Guess what? The brain does not separate knowledge from skills. And in fact, you can learn something, and when it's knowledge, and when you practice it enough, it becomes a skill. Well, what's that all about? So you'll have these kind of really misleading ideas coming often from psychology, because they're not looking at things from first principles. How does the brain really operate? And that's what the book Uncommon Sense Teaching is all about. And plus, it's fun. You can actually learn these ideas. There's really cute ways that you can understand, at least metaphorically, what is happening in the brain. And then you can use it practically to help yourself, with your teaching, or if you're learning, with your learning.
You are right when you say that it's funny, because the book includes a lot of like metaphors that, of course, it came from really complex ideas from neuroscience that are hard to understand, but with those metaphors and image you include in the book, is really more easy to find out what it means. And here I have a quote about, from the book that say, neuroscience supports an understanding of teaching and learning and vice versa, both directly and via its connection to psychology. Is what you were saying. Sometimes psychology or cognitive psychology in specific is not enough to give us a complete vision of how learning works. And I agree that neuroscience give us that. There's a lot of things I didn't know before reading this book, especially from neuroscience. Like we can talk about that later. But I was thinking about people that say that is a bit dangerous, like to take knowledge of neuroscience directly to for recommendations to teachers, like because we know there's a lot of neuromyths and maybe some misunderstanding of how the brain works, maybe the like how the hemispheres works separately or integrated, or like we just use the 10% of our brain, something like that. And people say that sometimes people misunderstand that because it's the knowledge of neuroscience is so complex that it's easy to fall into those neuromyths. What do you think about that?
So let's look at how you first framed this situation. You said psychologists think it's dangerous. That's very true. Who is it dangerous for? It's dangerous for psychologists. Because if people start realizing that neuroscience is more foundational, then they will start trusting neuroscience more than they trust psychologists. And when people might find out that neuroscience is actually really easy to understand, especially if you use metaphors, well, then that becomes even more dangerous for psychologists because they're
understanding
more peripheral to educational theory, because people are going to want to go to the neuroscience. So what is their, ultimately, what is their goal? I mean, think about this. Let's say that I taught psychology by teaching psychology myths. That's not teaching what's going on in psychology. Let's say that I taught math by teaching math myths, or history by teaching history myths. So if you look, it amazed me. I did a review once I was asked to review a paper that had been submitted on neuroscience education around the world. And they had done a massive study, and do you know what they found? Virtually every university that taught about neuroscience, all they taught was a course on neuromyths. This is not the neuroscience of learning. This is a subtle, backhanded way to make neuroscience look bad, right? And the reality is neuroscience has so much to inform us about. Even that idea of you can get knowledge within that declarative system, the hippocampal system, and when you practice enough, it becomes something like a skill. That's like when you drive home every day. At first, the knowledge, the facts of you turn right here, you turn left here, blah, blah, blah. But then after you've done it 100 times, you can find yourself at home without even realizing how you got home. It's because you've laid those declarative links. I mean, those automatic links. And that can allow you to do things without even thinking about it and being conscious of it. these kinds of unconscious, speedy skills are essential for laying a foundation for math, for learning a foreign language, for playing a musical instrument, all sorts of things. But people don't even understand it if you just take a psychological approach where something goes into long-term memory magically, and you don't really talk about what's actually happening
in the middle. Yeah.
Change. So I have to laugh because a lot of the pushback from psychology about neuroscience is a bridge too far is simply a way of circling the wagons and protecting their field while trying to make neuroscience look bad.
Yeah. Well, I think there's not only the psychologists. There's also some teachers like that have written some books about this, and there have a lot of cautions about this. But I think that books like yours, like Uncommon Sense Teaching, helps a lot to go further about this, and because I think it's important to teach more deeply and easily about neuroscience to teachers, so they can have the tools for analyzing when something is a neuromyth or a misunderstanding, when someone wants to sell something that could be a mistake. So I read a paper a few weeks ago from Roberto Ferreira, who is a Chilean teacher and neuroscientist. He said that the teachers that have some general knowledge about, just general knowledge, as you said, like probably just one course about neuroscience, something like this, or they are like learning by themselves. They are really interested in neuroscience, but paradoxically, they also believe more in those kind of myths, because it's like they are interested, but maybe they haven't had the opportunity to be thought in a nice way about neuroscience. So I think that this book is really incredible for helping teachers to understand what is happening in the brain actually. And we are going to talk about these neural pathways, the procedural and declarative pathways that I find that is great. And also, you mentioned the hippocampus. I didn't know a lot about before about the role of hippocampus in learning, and I think it's really important because it helps us to understand things like why spaced repetition is important, why some poses when we are learning are really useful for learning, long-term learnings, and so on. So that's incredible. But let's talk about the fundamentals. Let's talk about quadrupedus and closets. This octopus that has 4 legs or less. The book has many surprising metaphors and images that help the reader to understand the complexities of neuroscience. And one of those metaphors is thinking about memory, composed by working memory and a lot long-term memory. And I find really useful this image of a quadrupedus, like this octopus that has just 4 legs or less. Can you tell us more about those, how you represented by metaphors, the working memory and long-term memory?
Back in the 1950s, George Miller, a psychologist at Harvard, he came up with the idea that, our working memory, like what we can hold temporarily in mind, is about 7 objects plus or minus 2. And this is a perfect example of how psychology has actually, it's really pointed us in the right direction. And his work was brilliant, not only in that, but in many other areas. And as we've begun to be able to look more closely into the brain, it's always hard. It's like you can hold 7 pieces of information. Well, what does 7 pieces of information mean? I mean, is it big? Is it little? Is it,
What is a piece? Like a chunk? What is?
Yeah, what is that? And so the brilliant work of subsequent psychologists and psychologists/neuroscientists, because Nelson Cowan is kind of halfway, a foot in each camp. He's sort of brought us to understand it's probably fewer things that we can hold in mind, maybe 4, maybe even 2 pieces of information. But those pieces of information can be really big if we've practiced a lot, so you can pull the whole idea into mind. Like, if I said to you, "Здравствуйте, как вы поживаете?" That's hello, how are you? In Russian, you wouldn't be able to remember it and say it. But for me, I've got that whole sequence, so it's easy for me to pull it to mind. That's almost like 1 chunk for me, or maybe 2. Hello, how are you? So what psychologists initially thought of this as was you've got 4 slots in working memory, or 7 slots, so to speak, that you could put those little chunks of information in. But having the benefit of all the great work they've done, I could see that perhaps an even better metaphor was to, have a little octopus-like critter, which is in the prefrontal cortex, that could reach back into long-term memory and grab pieces of information. And it's no metaphor is perfect, and this is deeply imperfect in some ways, but it really gets that idea of you've got something that can reach out and grab, but we'll cut off some arms of the octopus to make only 4 arms, so it's a quadrupus, not an armed octopus. Then you can imagine much more easily, you've got these arms, they in some sense reach back into long-term memory, grab the idea, grab that chunk, those sets of connected neurons. How do they grab them? How does it connect in? Well, that's an open question for research right now. But so I just thought, let's use an octopus or a quadrupus, because it might help us see it a little bit more easily than this slot idea, which had originally been used. And that's one of the benefits about, having hindsight. You can look at what they did. You can do something that's even better. And then everybody thinks, well, you're really good. But actually, you were standing on the shoulders of giants while you were doing it. But there is so much evidence that using a good metaphor is a really terrific way to help convey ideas much more quickly, because you're giving what are the key aspects? The key aspects in this case are you're able to hold only a certain amount of information, and you're reaching into long-term memory. When I was working on the book of mine for numbers, that's my first learning book, I reached out to thousands of the top teachers and professors in the English-speaking world and asked them, what do you do to help teach so effectively? And shocking numbers of them came back and said, well, my true secret is I use metaphor and analogy, but I often don't tell the other professors I use them. And the reason was because the other professors would laugh at them and say, that's why you're seen as such a good professor. It's just because you make it so easy for your students. But it's like, That's the job of a professor.
Or they can say that you are being like infantilizing the students or something like that. It's not the case.
Instead of making it more accessible, more understandable, and in some sense, conveying an even deeper understanding of what's truly going on. So when Ohm was coming up with the idea of electrical circuits and the flow of electricity and resistors and what they do, he used the metaphor of how water flows. Everybody ridiculed him, but even though at a quantum level it's not true, it actually allowed science to progress further. Same with an atom. At first we used that idea of it's similar to planets revolving around the sun. Was it actually true? In a greater metaphorical sense, it gets us closer to understanding what's truly going on. So use of metaphors, I can't urge teachers, parents, or you yourself enough to say, use a metaphor to convey difficult ideas. And nowadays there's easy ways to get metaphors. Just go to ChatGPT and say, I'm trying to understand or explain main garden scope in Python programming. What's a good metaphor? It will give you these wonderful metaphors. Don't just ask for one, ask for like 5. Tell them about your students, and it will put it in terms that they can understand.
Yeah, that's great. I was thinking about other metaphors, as we mentioned the hippocampus before. I have like the image in my head of the 3 characters that are part of the book, which are the working memory as this octopus or quadrupedus, and then you have the hip or hippocampus and neo, that is the neocortex. Can you explain that interaction between the 3 of these characters and what it means?
So this is really interesting. And this, again, is where it helps to really understand what's going on in the brain. When a student is listening to a lecture, what they're doing is they're getting information into working memory, hopefully, if they're paying attention. Yeah. And then it is going to the hippocampus, like this little way station. We like to represent the hippocampus as this smarmy little guy called hip. And so you have working memory, information goes into working memory, goes from there to the hippocampus, and it stops there. And the hippocampus will collect this information. It can hold it like temporarily, maybe 15, 20 minutes. Okay, now stop with input into working memory. So you stop talking and allow a student to think for a minute, or turn to their neighbor for a minute. When nothing is coming in temporarily to that working memory, that hippocampus, hip, can turn around and talk to neo, the neocortex, long-term memory, and say, hey, Neo, guess what we just learned? I'm going to reinforce this to you. And it will talk to, in some sense, and reinforce the ideas that have weakly gone in there, but it will strengthen those. So this is why little active breaks, where, like a little time where a student can even, people will often say, oh, well, talking to other students, that's where it's really all at. No, it's not necessarily that. It could just be when you have a minute, where you're turning around to your neighbor, nothing is really coming in, that allows for a little a relaxing break where your hippocampus can begin reinforcing things. And this, I have to bring up, there's a very effective way of studying called the Pomodoro technique. And with this, you study for 25 minutes, no like nothing popping up on your computer screen, nothing on your cell phone or anything. You study as intently as you can for 25 minutes, set a timer. And if your mind wanders off, you bring it back. Then after 25 minutes, pause and see if you can retrieve the information you just learned from your own mind, not by focusing. See, when you are not focusing outside, when you're focusing inside, you're starting to activate that diffuse mode. So take like 2 or 3 minutes, and then, kind of, what did I just learn? And then here's the capper. Take 2 to 3 minutes and do nothing. Do not pick up that cell phone, because once you do, you are going back into the focus mode. And what you need nothing coming in. Your hippocampus is reinforcing. You don't know what's going on. You can't feel it, but it's reinforcing. And then it's also putting little tags there that's saying, oh, you know that information that I just retrieved? That's really important information. Let's put some tags there. And then what happens at night is really interesting. It's like your brain is kind of like a toilet bowl. It has swirling waves going around it. And those traveling waves are looking for tags. And the tagged material that you tagged when you were just sitting there doing nothing, guess what? That actually helps you to build and strengthen those links. Sorry, I went off on a little side tangent here, but this is how you do a very, very powerful Pomodoro. 25 minutes of focus, 3 to 5 minutes of retrieval, looking inside, which is diffuse mode, and then, another 3 minutes of relaxing, where you're actually doing learning.
Yeah, that's one of the things I think that neuroscience is critical to understand. Like, why sometimes we are trying to retrieve something or understand something, and we can't do it in that moment. But then, I don't know, we are working with our dogs or something more, not thinking about anything specific, and then you have like a insight, like a surprise insight, like, oh yeah, I understand that, doing anything more. And it's like really strange, but this information is clearly helpful for understanding that. Another interesting metaphor is when you talk about the different kind of learners. We have like some learners that are faster than others, and you talk about the race car learners to represent how learners with more working memory capacity and processing like that are faster while learning. And in contrast, there would be some hiker learners who are like slower, but also can be very successful if they are persistent enough, like us, I think.
Yeah.
We're that kind of learner. What are the main difference between those kind of learners, and why does it imply for educators?
So I talk about race car learners where they can get to the finish line super fast, but everything goes by in a blur. And I talk about hiker learners where they can get to the finish line, but they're a lot slower, but they can reach out and touch the leaves on the trees, see the little rabbit trails, hear the birds. Completely different experience, but in some ways much richer and deeper. The challenge, so I'm dividing things up into race car and hiker. The reality, of course, is they can be anything in between. And sometimes people can be race cars in one subject and hikers in another. So I'm dividing things up here just as an illustration to help us kind of see the main ideas. But one important aspect of this is that many, not all, but a substantial portion of what we call really smart people have a great memory. And this is I would love to have a great memory, but there is one thing that can frequently, not always, but frequently accompany that great memory, and that's intellectual inflexibility. For example, your little neurons, they learn something and it sticks there. They have a great memory. But then let's say you're wrong. Well, you've already learned it. And you've got to do some rewiring there if you're wrong. And that can be very hard, that rewiring, rethinking of things. It can be really hard for someone with a really retentive set of neurons. So what can happen, and again, this is on average, but there are always exceptions. So for example, my co-instructor, Terry Sinowski, is freaking brilliant, but he's also, if I, on rare occasions, might say, no, Terry, you're wrong here. He'll be like, he'll look at it, and if I'm making a good point, he can easily change his mind. But that's not the case for many people. And so, or for a fair number of really smart people. And I think we all have known, don't you wonder sometimes, there's these world-class experts in economics or in history or physics, and they're like arguing with one another. They have completely opposite views, and you're looking at them going, they're both super smart. Somebody is wrong here. Which one is it? And oftentimes you just can't tell if you're an outsider. And sometimes the really smart people themselves, they truly believe it, and it doesn't matter what evidence you give them, they can't change their mind. So a perfect example is Friedrich Hayek, the great economist. He was a very slow learner. He was like us, it just kind of went through. But here's the good thing about what you do, Matthias, is you really are looking at things. You're not jumping to conclusions because you're just such a swift thinker. That means you will notice when there's an error, when everybody is saying, oh yeah, this is obviously true. And you're going, wait a minute, that's not obvious to me. And that's what Hayek did. He looked, and he said, oh, wait a minute, there's an error here, because he was going so slow. He could pick out the errors, and it was the errors, that his super brilliant colleagues just jumped right over, assuming it was true. Well, Friedrich didn't do that. And so that's how he won the Nobel Prize. So it made me laugh. I saw recently something, it popped up on LinkedIn, and there was a mention of learners, and then they mentioned Barbara Oakley, and they said, well, of course, she's a really bad example because, yes, she changed her brain, but she's clearly a genius. And so, we shouldn't use her as an example. And I just wanted to laugh, because if he had been my professor in, in engineering, he would not say, oh yeah, that Oakley, she's a real genius, because I generally had to most people would take 4 engineering classes. I could take 3. And that was about, but I would learn them really deeply. But I was very, very slow. I remember, a good friend of mine, I would spend all weekend doing these homework problems. And he said, "Oh yeah, I knocked those out in two hours." And I'm just like, "That's no fair.
Yeah.
Why did I get fast?" So I think it just is helpful for all of us to realize if you're a slow learner, there is a place for you. You can do things that even geniuses cannot.
Yeah, that's why I think you are so inspiring, because that's something we can relate. Those people as us that we have experienced that the long hours trying to understand something and trying to find errors. And I recently find out that I have ADHD.
Lucky man.
Yeah. But it's like, I understand now why I had so much problems at the school. But also I feel always different. I have felt always different about how I think and how I learn, and but I went through a lot of struggles while studying. So I had to compensate that difficulty with other skills. So yeah, it's like I also wouldn't say that you are a genius, but you are someone who knows a lot because you have studied a lot, like effortfully. So yeah.
Well, I think a really important point here is how we ourselves can shape what kind of person we turn out to be. People just look at me and they say, "Oh, well, she's clearly a genius," even though they have no idea that if I come up with it, sometimes I mean, I will come up with things no one else is thinking of. But part of that is simply that I have exposed myself to many different backgrounds. And that exposure, that deliberate, willingness to grow comfortable with being uncomfortable sometimes, which is what new learning or new experiences can involve, can shape you. I mean, I could have just easily have been, just a clerk in a store, or an office manager, or an office worker. I could have easily been that, and there's actually nothing wrong with that. It's pretty helpful for society. But it's just this willingness to really also incorporate different perspectives, different experiences. That's what helps me be, people are like, "You're so naturally creative," but that's not really true. However, I should point out that with ADHD, there's a special secret superpower that people with attentional disorders can have. And that is, if they themselves become curious about something, not that somebody else told them, "Oh, you have to be curious about what you're learning in this class, we want you to be," but if you yourself become curious, you can hyper focus. That dopamine, which can help you learn, is kind of minimized. There's not so much of it in a person with ADHD. But if they themselves become interested, they can, for some reason, not be so distractible and really learn something deep. My hero in science, Santiago Ramon y Cajal, had clear evidence of substantive ADHD. But when he became interested in neuroscience, he went from the kid who flunked out of school, was a complete failure, was a terrible, to winning the Nobel Prize. And now he's the father of modern neuroscience. And again, he said, "I was no genius." But he said, "I have worked with many geniuses, and they will jump to conclusions. And when they're wrong, they can't change their mind." So slow learning can have its real advantages.
Yeah, great. So let's jump to something we mentioned before, these procedural and declarative pathways, neural pathways or systems. I think that other big ideas teacher and school leaders should know about this book are that those different systems that I understand that they work like differently, but also complement each other. And the best learning should be one that connect the both of those systems. How does it mean to learn something through our brain's declarative and procedural systems?
So declarative goes through that hippocampus. This is a pathway that we use when someone is explaining things to us. So clearly, if you read something from a book or you watch a video and someone's explaining, you're learning something. And it's going into your working memory through your hippocampus. Remember, it's kind of stopping there, waiting for a little hesitation, and then it goes into long-term memory. Mm-hmm. So that's one way you learn. The other way you learn is you are not aware of your learning at all. It's like when you're hitting a baseball, you hit it again and again, and you're learning how to hit the baseball. But you have no idea how you're learning to hit the baseball. You're not conscious of it, not the way you are when it's something explanatory or you're using that declarative system. This automatic or procedural basal ganglia system is, that's how you learn motor skills. So you just have to do it, right? Yeah. But it's also how you learn your native language. You go, mama, mama, ba, 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 mama. Oh, mama says, you just said mama. And you get feedback and you learn your native language that way. So this is the pattern, or this is the system that, like, when you do things enough times, it will build a nice network of your memory, your what you know. But the thing is, if you do something enough times, like you can get something in with declarative, then you practice it. You build that basal ganglia automatic knowledge. This is the system. It's not just motor skills. It's not just language. No. It's also a pattern recognition system for very complex things. So like if I say, so you're supposed to say, I went to the store yesterday. If I said, I goed to the store yesterday, a native English speaker instantly kind of goes, well, that's wrong, and you might say, well, why? Explain why. Well, you can't really, it's just wrong, you know? They may not even understand what an irregular verb means. They just know it's wrong. So that pattern recognition system of our rote memory can be extremely sophisticated. And a person, let's say that they're somewhat on the autistic spectrum, it can be more possible for a person on the autistic spectrum to have a really powerful basal ganglia system. This can allow them to look at equations, see the answer instantly, but not be able to explain it. So that's why, for example, teachers will say, well, if you can't explain it, you really don't understand it. That is not true. A student who's neuroatypical, who's somewhat on the autistic spectrum, may see clearly how to do a mathematical problem, but not be able to explain how they got the answer. But they got the answer because they intuited it through this basal ganglia system. So by understanding the brain, you can actually understand how to support these neuroatypical learners. It's ridiculous. I have a friend who's a vice president at Microsoft, and his son is a freaking genius, absolute genius. So he's in second grade. He's already doing graduate school vector calculus, and they're saying, if you can't explain, that you take 8 beans and add 13 beans, what that turns out to be, you need to be able to explain and show us with these beans. And because it's like he looks at it instantly and knows the answer. Why are you slowing this student down with silly questions that, might be very good for someone else, but because there's not an understanding of the teaching profession from the perspective of what is actually, how do we actually learn, teachers can inadvertently make these major mistakes that turn students off of learning. You only know it if you can explain it to me. No, that can turn some students off.
I was thinking about the example of learning a new language. Like in Chile, we are not a bilingual country, and for example, I study in a school that wasn't bilingual, so I had to. I always liked to learn English, but we used to be taught through a lot of like grammatical stuff, like probably more declarative stuff. So I know many people, my wife and friends, that they are afraid to talk because they know a lot of like vocabulary and grammatical structures and so on. But when they have to speak, it's like, I don't know why I can't find the words I want to say. And I say, like, that's because you have to just practice talking. Like, even
you are develop those automatic links as well. Exactly right.
Yeah. And that's something that confirms to me that I have just to talk, and if I do some mistakes, it's all good, and just to keep practicing. Let's talk about another topic, a bit different, but I also think that is great thing you put in the book. You have a full chapter about collaborative learning, and that's something that also in Chile is like some people think that is always good, or that should be like a strategy, like a silver bullet, something that always should work well. But in contrast with like individual work or listen too much teacher explanation, that's what people think often. But collaborative learning, like, I don't know, like group work or a project, a work project, and doesn't always result in effective learning for everyone. Like also it can lead to problems if teachers are not guiding that interaction, especially in schools. Like children don't have probably the social skills or emotional regulation enough to doing a good group work. But collaborative learning appears to be an essential learning tool, but it also have like some drawbacks. Can you tell us more about that potential problems and how the book addressed them?
During COVID, a young lady who was in 8th grade, probably about 13 years old in the US, wrote an op-ed for the New York Times and said, I really, I don't wish COVID on anyone, but at the same time, she said, I have to acknowledge that COVID has been the best possible thing for my improved learning. And the reason she said this was that everything was collaborative learning in her classes, because teachers thought, well, that's what we're told is the best way to learn. And so what they do is they just kind of dump students together and then say, well, you guys figured this out. Now figure that out. Think about it this way. We all understand the concept of the zero. But to figure out the concept of the zero actually took thousands and thousands of years until someone came up with this idea that gradually was refined, and then we got the idea of the zero. That's just the concept of the zero, much less addition, subtraction, multiplication, higher order mathematics. These are really difficult kinds of things for people to understand. And so what's going on is when we stick students together and say, figure something out, the space that we have 100 trillion synaptic connections in the brain. That's like 100 trillion different pathways our brains can follow. You stick a student down and say, figure this out. Even if you've got 5 students working together, they're lost. Without some good, careful guidance so that they know where they're going, they can just flounder around. And there's really good evidence from Project Follow Through that many teaching approaches, particularly those that are growing from student-centered constructivist approaches, actually can cause students to have learned less at the end of the year than they knew at the beginning of the year. They cripple students' abilities to learn. If you look, there's something called the Flynn effect, where IQ scores were found to rise from the 1930s to the 70s. And it was thought it was because of good educational methods. Since the 70s, in Western countries that are using constructivist student-centered approaches, it's been a substantive decline. And part of it is this idea of you can always just look things up. But part of it is teaching, like most teachers intuitively know the best ways to help students. And they're really good, and they are starved for fresh information, for guidance in how to teach properly that actually is based on solid insight in how we learn. And that is a lot of teachers nowadays who potentially are fantastic and sometimes still find ways to be fantastic. They're being taught ways to learn that sound really good, but they're actually antithetical to how we learn appropriately. Sure, some group work can be helpful because when you're looking at the eye of someone you are explaining something to and they're interacting with you, it actually can give you a little dopamine hit of pleasure. But if you start doing a lot of this and not getting appropriate, declarative, explanatory guidance to students, you are simply causing them to flounder around and go backwards in their learning. Good, collaborative learning can be good, but it's kind of like hot sauce. You use it for a little flavoring, but you don't rely on it all the time.
Yeah, and also because it's really typical to see that group works. You always have some members that are like free riders, or they don't do much stuff if you are not guiding that. And well, just to mention it, the book includes some appendix, like resources for teachers to understand more and work with their students to teach them how to collaborate in a good way. And also you talk about the collaboration clinics that are like these meetings with groups where the teacher can talk about the difficulties they are going through during their work, and helping them out to solve the problems, also the personal problems between them, and trying to guide that. So that's an incredible resource. And well, we are just finishing the interview, and it has been great. And I want to tell to the people who are listening that we will have this image that represent the metaphors and schemas that are in the book. We are going to upload them in our webpage, because you have them in English in your own webpage, but we are going to publish them also in Spanish in our Aptus website. So that's all, and thank you so much, Barbara. It has been such a privilege for me to interview you, and also I hope to keep learning from you and from others. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome.